The bells of St. Aldhelm rang slow over the frost the morning they buried Walter Pembroke, and in the third pew from the front, dressed in unrelieved black with her hands folded against the cold, his widow smiled. It was a small thing, gone almost before it arrived, a brief softening at the corner of her mouth as the coffin passed her into the December light. The village saw it, all of it. The village always saw. Behind their gloves and their prayer books, the mourners of Harrogate turned the smile over among themselves. The way a man turns a coin, he suspects is false. And by the time the last spadeful of earth had fallen, they had decided what kind of woman would smile above her husband's grave. Cordelia Pembroke felt their eyes find her one by one. She kept her chin level, and her gaze upon the stone. She did not explain herself because there was no one present to whom an explanation would have been welcome, and because the thing she had felt in that single, unguarded instant was too large and too strange to be folded into the small words the morning would have permitted her. What none of them knew, what she could scarcely admit inside the privacy of her own breast, was that the smile had not been triumph, and had not been malice. It had been the first easy breath she had drawn in 4 years. The weight that lifted from her chest as the coffin sank was the weight of a man who had taken her at 19 to settle a debt her dead father had left, and who had spent every season since teaching her that a wife was a possession to be corrected. She had learned to grow small. She had learned to be quiet at the right times and silent at all the others. And when the bells rang and the cold air struck her face, and she understood, all at once and entirely, that the correcting was over, her body had done the one thing she had forbidden it for 4 years. It had told the truth. There was one person in the churchyard who did not look at her as the others looked. He stood apart near the lych gate, tall and very still, in a dark traveling coat, his hat held against his chest. And where the rest of Harrogate studied the widow as one studies a curiosity, this man watched her the way one watches weather coming in from the sea. Adrian Vane had arrived from the north only the night before, summoned by a solicitor's letter that named him heir to an estate he had not wished for, and an uncle he had not loved. He had seen the smile. He had seen also the thing the village had not troubled to notice, which was that the widow's gloved hands were pressed so hard against one another that the kidskin had gone white across the knuckles, and that a woman whose heart was light does not hold herself together with her own 2 hands. Stay a moment with her if you have ever been seen wrongly by a room full of people who were certain. You will want to know how this ends. The house called Raxley sat above the village behind a long avenue of bare limes, gray-stoned and handsome and cold in every season, and it had been Cordelia's prison and her address in equal measure since the week she married. She returned to it from the churchyard in a borrowed carriage, for the Pembroke carriage had gone with a will into a tangle of claims, and she sat very upright on the worn seat and watched the limes go by, and felt nothing she could name. The housekeeper, Mrs. Comper, Finch, met her at the door with reddened eyes, though whether the redness was for the master or for the mistress, no one could have said, and helped her out of the black mantle that had grown heavy with the morning's damp. There would be guests. There were always guests after a burial, the cold ham and the warm sherry and the low voices, and Cordelia moved among them in the long drawing-room with its shrouded mirrors, and accepted their condolences with a stillness they found unsettling. She had learned her stillness in a hard school. She did not know how to put it down. It was in that room, beneath a portrait of the late master, turned now to the wall, by Mrs. Gactor. Finch's quiet hand, that Cordelia first heard the word that would follow her through the winter. She was standing near the window with an untouched glass, when 2 women of the parish drew together by the fire, and one of them said, behind a fan held an inch too high, that she had never in her life seen anything so unfeeling, that the cold widow had not shed a single tear, that some women were simply born without the ordinary affections. The fan did not quite cover the words. It was not meant to. Cordelia looked out at the frosted garden and did not turn her head, and the cold of the glass came through to her fingertips, and somewhere beneath her ribs, the old familiar smallness began to fold her up again. She had been the debtor's daughter. She had been the difficult wife. Now she would be the cold widow. The village had always needed a name for her, and it had always chosen one that left her no room to be anything else. She thought, standing there with the sherry untasted in her hand, of the morning 4 years before when the same parish had watched her go up the same aisle in a borrowed veil to marry a man old enough to be her father, and how they had clucked then too, but kindly, calling it a sensible arrangement and a fortunate match for a girl with nothing. And how not one of them had asked the girl whether she wished it. The arranging had been done over her head by men in a paneled room, her father's creditor and her father's lawyer, and her father himself, gray with shame, who had pressed her hand at the church door and told her she was saving them all, and that she was a good girl, and then had died within the year and left her to the saving. She had been 21 when she understood fully what she had been sold into. She was 25 now. She had spent the 4 years between learning the particular geography of a cruel man's moods, where the safe ground lay and where it gave way, and the learning had hollowed something out of her that she did not think could be filled again. The parish saw a cold woman. They did not see that the cold had been put into her on purpose, a degree at a time, by a man they had all called a respectable gentleman, and that the smile at the graveside had been the first warmth to escape her in longer than she could clearly remember. Adrian came late to the gathering and stayed at its edge. He had spent the hours since the burial closeted with the solicitor, Mr. Pram. Hale, a careful graying man who laid before him the full and disordered estate of his uncle, as one might lay out the contents of a drowned man's pockets. There were debts Adrian had not expected, and provisions he liked still less. Chief among the latter was the matter of the widow. The late master had left his wife almost nothing of her own, only a small annuity hedged about with conditions, and the right to remain at Raxley until such time as the heir should marry or require the house, which was to say, no right at all that a man might not revoke in an afternoon. Mr. Hale had explained this with the delicacy of a man who knows the cruelty of what he reads aloud, and Adrian had listened and had said nothing, and had thought of the white knuckles in the churchyard. When he finally entered the drawing-room and the parish women turned to take his measure, he crossed the floor without hurrying, and stopped before the widow at the window and bowed, and said only that he was sorry for the cold, and that she ought to come nearer the fire. It was not what one said to a grieving woman. It was what one said to someone one wished to bring in from the weather. Cordelia looked up at him, surprised into meeting his eyes, and found there no curiosity and no judgment, only a steady, gray attention that asked nothing of her. She did not go to the fire. For the first time that day, though, the smallness in her chest stopped folding. She did not sleep that night. She sat instead in the small east room that had been hers, the one room in the house her husband had not cared to enter, and she opened the single drawer that held the few things that were truly her own. There was not much. A miniature of her mother who had died when Cordelia was a child, a bundle of her father's letters, foolish and loving, and full of the schemes that had ruined them both, and pressed flat between the pages of a book of sermons she had never read, a single cornflower, blue gone to violet with the years, that a boy she had known before her marriage had given her on a summer afternoon when she had believed her life would be an ordinary, gentle thing. She held the flower to the candle and did not weep. She had learned not to weep where weeping could be heard, and the habit did not leave a person simply because the reason for it had been carried out of the church, in a box. What she felt instead was a great and frightening emptiness, the emptiness of a corridor when a noise that has filled it for years suddenly stops. She did not yet know how to live in the quiet. She thought she might never learn. The days after a death have their own gray weather, and the days at Raxley settled into it. Adrian took up the running of the estate with a quiet competence that surprised the servants who had expected a stranger from the north to be either a brute or a fool, and found him neither. He rose early. He rode the boundaries. He sat with Mr. Hale over the account books until the candles guttered, and slowly, patiently, he began to set in order the wreckage his uncle had left. Cordelia kept to the east room and the morning room and the cold, formal garden, and she and the heir moved through the great house on separate currents, meeting only at the long table at dinner where the silence between them was broken by Mrs. Pollinger. Finch's footsteps and the snapping of the fire. He did not make conversation, neither did she. She began, all the same, to notice things. She noticed that the portrait of her husband stayed turned to the wall, and that no one ordered it righted. She noticed that the fire in the morning room was lit before she came down to it, though she had given no such instruction, and that the draught from the east window, which had whistled at her through 4 winters, had been quietly stopped with new lead. She noticed that when she came late and cold to the table, there was always a dish kept warm at her place, and that he never remarked upon it, never made her thank him, simply ate his own dinner, as though warmth were the ordinary condition of the house, and not a thing he had arranged. These were small things, and she told herself they were nothing, the ordinary management of a careful man, and she did not let herself add them together because adding them together led somewhere she did not dare to go. Yet they accumulated all the same, the way snow accumulates, each soft particular landing without weight, and the whole of it slowly changing the shape of the ground. One evening in the 2nd week she came down to find that the worn chair by the morning room fire, the one she had always used because it was furthest from the door, and a person furthest from the door is least often noticed, had been mended in the seat where the cane had given way, and a cushion she did not recognize set into it. She stood looking at the chair for a long moment. In 4 years, no one had mended anything for her comfort. She had mended for others, had darned and patched and made do, had grown expert in the small economies of a household run on a hard man's grudging purse. To be the one for whom a thing was quietly repaired, not told of it, and not asked to be grateful, undid her more than any cruelty could have done, because cruelty she understood and had armor against. And this she had none. She sat down in the mended chair. She put her cold hands toward the fire, and she found, to her own great alarm, that her eyes had filled, and that she was glad the room was empty, and that some part of her had begun, against every instruction she had given it, to listen for his step in the passage. It was the child who broke the silence between them, as children will. Adrian had not come to Raxley alone. With him from the north had come his sister's daughter, a small grave girl of 6 named Beatrice, whose mother had died in the spring, and whose father was a soldier abroad, and who attached herself to the quiet widow with the sudden total loyalty of a lonely child. Cordelia found her one morning in the cold garden, crouched at the edge of the frozen pond in slippers entirely wrong for the weather, weeping because she could not reach a holly branch heavy with berries that she wished to take indoors. And Cordelia, who had been taught for 4 years that her own wants were an imposition, and had learned to want nothing aloud, knelt at once in the frost beside the child, and gathered her up, and broke the branch with her own hands, and pricked her palm, doing it, and did not mind. She carried Beatrice indoors, and warmed her feet at the morning room fire, and told her a story her own mother had told her, a foolish gentle story about a fox and a moon, and she did not know, because her back was to the door, that Adrian stood in the passage and watched. The child had stopped crying. She sat in the curve of the widow's arm with her wet slippers steaming faintly at the fender and her thumb at her mouth, and Cordelia chafed the small cold feet between her warm hands and told the story in a low, even voice, doing all the parts the sly fox and the patient moon. And somewhere in the middle of it the grave little girl laughed, a single startled hiccup of a laugh, the first Raxley had heard from her since she came. He had come to call the child to her lessons. He did not call her. He watched the widow the village had named Cold Hold, a weeping child against the winter, and felt something in his chest move that he had believed buried 4 years and more, in a churchyard far to the north, beneath a stone he had not been able to visit since. For Adrian had buried a wife. This was the thing he carried, and did not speak of the thing Mr. Hale knew and the servants whispered. And Cordelia did not. He had married young and for love, against the wishes of his family, a gentle, clever woman named Eleanor, who had died bearing a child that had not lived. While he was 3 days' ride away on business, he had told himself could not wait. He had come home to 2 graves and an empty house, and the certain knowledge that had he only stayed, the doctor might have come in time. He had not forgiven himself. He had not tried. He had gone north and made himself useful and made himself hard. And he had told himself that he had finished with the part of life that wanted things. And he had believed it, and it had been a kind of peace. And now he stood in a cold passage in his dead uncle's house and watched a woman kneel in the frost for a child who was not hers, and the peace he had built deserted him entirely, and he was left with the unbearable thing underneath it, which was hope. He went out alone that afternoon and rode the high boundary of the estate where the wind came hard off the moor, and he let the cold scour at him until his face ached, because the ache was easier to account for than the other thing. He had kept Eleanor's last letter folded in the breast of his coat for 4 years, the paper soft now as cloth along the folds, and he did not need to take it out to read it, having long since learned every word the way one learns a wound. She had written to him on the second day of his absence, cheerful and unworried, teasing him for fussing, telling him the child was lively and the doctor unnecessary, and that he should attend to his business and come home to her when it was done. She had been wrong about the doctor. He had been wrong to believe her. He had stayed his 3 days and come home to find the lively child stilled and Eleanor white and sinking, and past the reach of any word he could have said, and he had held her hand while she went, and she had not blamed him, which was the part he could not forgive, that she had not blamed him, and so had left the whole weight of the blaming to him. He had carried it north. He had carried it here. And the thing he understood, riding the cold boundary with the letter unread against his heart, was that he had spent 4 years making certain he would never again be in a position to fail someone he loved, by the simple method of loving no one. And that a small grave widow kneeling in the frost had walked straight through that defense as though it had never been built. He turned the horse for home as the light failed. He did not yet know what he meant to do. He knew only that he was no longer at peace, and that he was, in some buried, unwilling corner of himself, glad of it. If this is a story you have felt before in your own life, the slow turning of a heart you had given up for closed, then stay with Cordelia a little longer. The frost does not last. I promise you, the frost does not last. Before the thaw, though, there is the hardest part of any winter, the part where the cold goes deepest because the days have just begun, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen. The hardest part arrived in the person of Lady Marjorie Vane, the late master's sister, and Adrian's aunt, who descended upon Raxley in the second week with 2 trunks, a lady's maid, and the settled conviction that the family's affairs had been left in unsafe hands. She was a handsome, upright woman of 60, who had spent her life as the arbiter of what was done and not done in 3 counties. And she had come, she announced, to see her nephew properly established, and to see the awkward question of the widow properly settled. She did not trouble to lower her voice on the second point. Cordelia heard her own future discussed across the breakfast table as one discusses the disposal of an inconvenient piece of furniture, and she sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on her plate, and said nothing, because nothing was what she had been trained to say, and because Lady Marjorie's voice had in it the precise timbre of every voice that had ever decided her life for her. The widow could not remain, Lady Marjorie observed to her nephew as though the widow were not present. It was not seemly, a young woman and an unmarried man beneath one roof, whatever the relation. There was a cousin in Bath who might be prevailed upon to take her. There was the annuity. Small as it was, the thing wanted only firmness and a little arrangement, and Lady Marjorie had not in her life lacked for either. Adrian set down his cup. He said in the level voice the servants had learned to mark that Mrs. Pembroke would remain at Raxley as long as she wished it, and that the subject was closed. The words were quiet. They fell into the room like stones into a still pond, and Lady Marjorie's brows rose, and Cordelia's heart did something complicated and painful behind her ribs, and across the table the eyes of the widow and the heir met for the space of one breath before both looked away. She did not understand him. A man did not defend a woman. He meant only to be rid of in a kinder season. and yet she could not let herself believe he meant anything more, because the believing was a door she had nailed shut a long time ago and did not trust herself to open. That night she took the cornflower from its book of sermons and held it a long time in the candlelight. And she thought against all her training, against 4 years of careful smallness of gray eyes that asked nothing of her, and she was afraid. Lady Marjorie was not a woman to be closed off by a single sentence, and she changed her method. Where firmness had failed, she applied society, which had never failed her yet. She let it be known in Harrogate, and beyond that, Raxley would receive again that the period of mourning decently brief for an uncle one had hardly known was concluding, and that the heir meant to take his proper place among the families of the county. She invited, she arranged, and chief among her arrangements was Miss Helena Croft, the daughter of a baronet from the next valley, 23 and golden and accomplished, who arrived for a fortnight's visit with a great many gowns, and the easy confidence of a young woman who has been told since the nursery that she is the natural ornament of any room she enters. Lady Marjorie placed her beside Adrian at dinner. She drew out her playing and her singing in the long evenings. She managed, with the practiced invisibility of the truly skilled, to leave the two of them together in the morning room, in the gallery, on the terrace, while the widow was sent on errands that took her elsewhere. And Helena Croft, who was not unkind, but who had also never in her life been required to consider that she might not be wanted, took up her role with a will and found the grave northern air a fascinating object of her attention. Cordelia watched it all from the edges where she had always lived, and told herself it was nothing to her. She had no claim. She had no right. She was the cold widow with her annuity, and her conditions permitted to remain by a kindness she could not account for, and a woman in her position did not let herself feel the small bright stab she felt each time Helena laid a gloved hand upon Adrian Vane's sleeve, and laughed. She busied herself with Beatrice. She walked in the frozen garden. And she did not see, because she had taught herself not to look, that Adrian's eyes followed her from across every crowded room, that he answered Helena with a courtesy as flat and smooth as river ice, that the only time the hardness left his face entirely was when the widow knelt to button the child's coat or tucked a strand of the child's hair behind her ear. The household saw it. Mrs. Finch saw it and said nothing, and smiled into the linen press. Lady Marjorie saw it, and her handsome mouth grew thin, and she understood that she had brought into the house not a remedy, but a rival, and she began to consider what a woman of resource might do about a widow who would not take the hint and go. The thing she did was small and exact and cruel in the way that only entirely respectable things can be. There was an evening, the largest of the season at Raxley, when the families of 3 Valleys came in their carriages up the avenue of limes, and the long drawing-room was opened and full, and the chandeliers were lit, and the musicians played, and Cordelia, who had not wished to come down at all, was prevailed upon by Beatrice to wear the one good gown she owned, a soft gray silk gone a little out of fashion, and to enter the bright room on the heir's invitation. For Adrian had asked her gravely in the passage whether she would do him the honor of coming down, and she had said yes before her caution could stop her mouth, and for an hour she had stood near the fire and felt almost like a woman among other women rather than a problem to be solved. Then Lady Marjorie, smiling in a voice pitched to carry across the lull between 2 airs, asked the company whether they had heard the curious thing about the late dear Walter's funeral. How his young widow had been seen to smile above the very coffin. Such composure, Lady Marjorie said, in such a young woman, one hardly knew what to make of it. The cold widow, someone murmured, and the murmur ran round the bright room like a draught, and every face turned, and Cordelia stood in her soft gray silk in the center of all of them, with the old smallness rising to close over her head like water. This was the 3rd time she had heard it, and it was the worst, because this time it was meant to finish her. Lady Marjorie had chosen her ground with care. The label had been a private unkindness at the burial, and a fan-hidden cruelty at the funeral gathering, and now it was a public verdict delivered in a full bright room before the families of 3 Valleys, and there was no glass to turn her face to, and no garden to walk into, only the turned faces and the waiting silence and Helena's small, startled pity, which was somehow the hardest thing of all to bear. She felt the old retreat begin in her body, the one her marriage had taught her, the drawing in of the shoulders and the lowering of the eyes, and the careful blankness of the face that gave a cruel observer nothing to fasten upon. It had kept her safe for 4 years, and it betrayed her now because to a room that had already decided she was cold, the blankness only proved the verdict. And she could feel it proving it, could feel the company nodding inwardly, see how she takes it, not a tremor, not a tear. The woman has no heart at all. The candle flame stood very straight in the still air. The gray silk of her one good gown, which an hour ago had made her feel almost like a woman among women, hung on her now like a borrowed thing, like the proof of her presumption in having come down at all. Somewhere near the door, a young woman tittered and was hushed. Lady Marjorie stood with her fan at the measured height of perfect composure and watched her work take effect with the calm of a gardener who has at last got the better of a weed. Cordelia opened her mouth and found nothing in it. 4 years of silence had taken even this from her, the power to speak for herself in the moment she most needed it, and she stood mute and burning while the room decided, once and finally, what she was. She set down her glass. She would leave the room, and she would leave the house, and she would go to the cousin in Bath, or to anywhere at all. That was not this, and she would be the cold widow forever, because it was easier than the unbearable labor of being seen truly by people who had already decided not to see her. She turned for the door, and then Adrian crossed the room. He did not hurry. He came across the bright floor through the parting company in his dark coat, past his aunt, past Helena, and her startled pity, past the turned faces of 3 valleys, and he stopped before the widow, where she stood frozen at the edge of leaving, and he took her cold hand in both of his, in front of every eye in Harrogate. The room went very still. Somewhere a musician's bow hung above its string, and Adrian looked down at the woman the village had named Cold, and said in the level voice that carried to every corner of the silent room that she had smiled because the man was cruel and she was free. The words were not many. They were not poetry. They were the plainest things in the world, and they were true, and they did in 7 seconds what 4 years of her careful endurance had not been able to do, which was to tell the room the thing it had refused to see. He had known. All this time, from the lich gate and the white knuckles, from the portrait turned to the wall, and the draft stopped with new lead, he had known what her smile had meant, and he had said it aloud, where it could not be unsaid. Cordelia felt the breath go out of her. She felt his hands warm around her cold one, and she felt rising up through the burning shame, a thing she had not felt since before her marriage, and had believed herself past feeling, which was the simple animal relief of being defended. Her eyes filled. She did not look away from him. And in the stillness Lady Marjorie's voice came, thin now and uncertain, beginning some practiced sentence about composure and seemliness, and breaking off halfway, because there is no script in all of society for the moment when the order one has protected one's whole life turns out to have been protecting cruelty, and the handsome upright woman of 3 counties found, perhaps for the first time, that she had nothing whatever to say. It was Helena who moved first, and in moving showed herself better than the role she had been given. She crossed to the widow's other side, and she said simply and clearly, so that the room could hear it, that she, for one, had always thought there was more to Mrs. Pembroke than the parish allowed, and she took Cordelia's other hand. The company stirred. An old gentleman by the fire said gruffly that Walter had been a hard man and no mistake, that everyone had known it and no one had said it, and that perhaps it was past time someone did. A woman who had spoken behind her fan 3 weeks before looked at her own shoes. The verdict the room had rendered began, in small movements and lowered eyes, and murmured half apologies, to come undone, and Cordelia stood in the center of it, with a warm hand on either side of her, and understood that the morning in the churchyard had finally, by the long, slow working of one man's steady attention, been told the truth. She found Adrian, later on the terrace, where he had gone out into the cold to leave her room to breathe, the music had begun again behind them. The frost lay blue on the balustrade, under a thin moon, and their breath stood in the air between them. And for a long moment, neither spoke. She stood a little apart from him, with her arms wrapped about herself against the cold. And she was aware of him, the way one is aware of a fire in a dark room, the warmth of him reaching her across the space she did not yet dare to close. And she found that she knew exactly where he stood without looking. That some sense she had not known she possessed had been quietly mapping his position in every room for weeks. Her heart beat hard and high in her throat. She made herself speak before the courage failed, in a voice she had not used in 4 years, the voice from before. And she said that he ought not to have done it, that he had ruined his own standing in the county for a woman who came with conditions and an annuity and nothing else. And Adrian turned to her, and the hardness was entirely gone from his face. And he said that he had buried a wife he had failed to defend when defending her would have cost him everything, and that he had sworn over her grave that he would never again stand silent while the woman he loved was destroyed by people who were certain. The word fell between them in the cold. A woman he loved. He had not meant perhaps to say it so soon, and he did not take it back. Cordelia stood very still. Her heart, which had been folded small for 4 years, opened all at once like a hand, and it hurt, the way feeling returns to a limb gone numb, and she found that she was not afraid of the hurt. She reached up slowly, and laid her fingertips against his jaw, against the cold, rough line of it, the boldest thing she had done in her adult life. And she felt him go still beneath her touch, and the small distance between them held for one breath more, charged and trembling, the moment before a thing is done that cannot be undone. He bent his head. He stopped a hair's breadth from her, asking with his stillness rather than his words. And Cordelia, who had been given nothing she had wanted for 4 years, closed that last small distance herself and kissed him on the frost-cold terrace, softly and entirely, with everything in her that had not been crushed. They were married in the spring in the same church of St. Aldhelm where the bells had once rung slow over Walter's coffin, though this time the bells rang quick and bright, and the limes along the Raxley Avenue had come into their first green leaf. It was a small wedding. Lady Marjorie did not attend, having retired to Bath in a coolness that time would partly mend, but Helena stood up with the bride, and the old gentleman who had spoken by the fire gave her away, and the families of 3 valleys who had been so certain in December came in May with a generosity that had something of apology in it, the way a parish will when it has understood at last that it was wrong. Beatrice scattered cowslips down the aisle and dropped most of them in one heap halfway, and had to be retrieved. And Mrs. Finch wept frankly into a handkerchief the size of a tablecloth, and Adrian, waiting at the front of the church, watched his bride come up the aisle toward him in a gown that was new and pale and entirely her own, and did not trouble to compose his face. That night, when the guests had gone and the house was quiet and warm, Cordelia sat with her husband by the fire in the morning room where the draught had once whistled and was now stopped for good, and Beatrice slept against her shoulder, heavy and trusting in the firelight. And Cordelia took from the small drawer that held the few things that were truly her own, the single-pressed cornflower blue, gone to violet with the years, the flower a boy had given her on a summer afternoon when she had believed her life would be an ordinary gentle thing, before the debt and the marriage and the long cold school of being small. She did not put it back in the book of sermons she had never read. She set it instead in a little frame upon the mantel, where the firelight could reach it, where it could be seen. She had kept it all those years as a relic of a life she had been denied. She understood now that it had not been a relic at all, but a promise made to a girl by a summer afternoon, that the ordinary gentle thing would come to her, after all only later than she had thought, and by a harder road, and worth the more for the keeping. Outside the windows, the spring dark settled soft over the avenue of limes, and inside, the fire burned low and steady. And the woman the village had once called cold sat warm at last in a house that was her own, with a sleeping child on one side of her and on the other a man who had crossed a bright room to tell the truth. And she smiled. There was no one left to misread it. There never would be again. Not in that warm and quiet house. If Cordelia's long winter and her late spring moved you, stay a moment in the quiet with them before you go, and leave a word below for the moment that stayed with you most. The bells of St. Aldhelm are still ringing somewhere, quick and bright, and the cornflower keeps its color on the mantel, and the corridor that was silent for so long is full now of small ordinary sounds, which are, in the end, the only sounds that ever mattered. Thank you for staying until the very last of it.